Hi everybody, this is my first ever tutorial, hopefully with a lot more to come. The sound might be a little bit dodgy in places, but just bear with me and that is something that will improve the more that I do. I'm a pet portrait artist and previously I've only worked in soft pastel, but more recently I've started to also work on doing some digital pieces. This is going to be the first in a series of short tutorials just showing you exactly how I create the texture of fur without using fur brushes, as this is something I do get asked quite a lot on when I post pictures. The series is going to focus on different breeds of dogs and I'm going to go through different hair textures and how to achieve these looks. By doing it this way, it is a lot slower than using fur brushes, but because I want it to be difficult to tell the difference between a digital and non-digital portrait, then that is why I do it this way. And if you do want a quicker result, then fur brushes are going to be a better option for you. This particular tutorial, I've decided to focus on Labrador fur, and I've just selected a small area from the reference photo, just so it's easier for everybody to focus on it. And the reason that I have chosen a chocolate Labrador is because another thing that people can find a bit difficult is getting the richness of brown fur. And as we go through this tutorial, you'll see that we don't actually use any brown when creating this fur colour. I'm also going to go through today where I get the brushes that I use. I'll go through how I get this watercolour paper effect, tell you exactly where to buy both of those. I do recommend the paper effect if you can, because it does make a big difference to the finished product. So for my brushes, I use the Ultimate Watercolour brush set, and that's from Nathan Brown Art. So it includes all of the standard watercolour brushes. You've got a range of different washes here, and it also includes different splatter effects, which some people like to use at the end. And right at the bottom, you've got a range of smudges, which makes it look like you're adding water to the page, and that can just help to soften any edges. So the way that I get the paper to look like watercolour paper, that's also from Nathan Brown Art. You can buy this directly from his website along with the brushes, and it's the Wet Media Canvas Creator, and there's loads of different texture packs available in that set, and that gets imported to Procreate, and you can then just use the papers. You can duplicate them to create obviously more of the same one if there's a particular one that you like, and then all it does is it creates a paper layer here for you, and then you just build on top of those with your own layers to create your finished painting. Okay, so we're going to get started. So first off, I split my layers into a base coat, darks, midtones, and the highlights are right at the top here. This means we're always working from dark to light. I don't know if that is the right way for watercolour paintings, but for the digital watercolour, it's worked really well for me. That's the technique that I know from my pastel art, so I've just carried that through. Right, so we're going to just fill in the base coat first, just make sure I'm on that layer, and we're going to just select the darkest colour in the reference that we're working on for the area. So I'm just going to go over here and just select that colour. That's like quite a deep purpley red. And using the Perfect Brush tool. So I use the Perfect Brush, but there's also the dried out one, which also works really well for filling in these base layers. And I'm going to have my brush size set just over midway. You can see the size there like that. And the opacity, that's going to be set to 100%. So although I'm working in a circle, I'm not going to worry too much about going outside of the lines. I'll just do as best I can, but can't be bothered with that. I'm also going to try and fill in this layer without taking my pencil off the paper, because the second you do, it's going to put another layer on top and darken up that, and we don't want to darken up everywhere. So we've finished that layer, and we're just going to darken up the areas that you can see in the reference are particularly darker than others. So we're just going to avoid this section in the middle, but everywhere else we're just going to fill in. This is a pressure sensitive brush as well, so the harder you press, the bigger your strokes are going to be. So just bear that in mind when you're working. It's fine to press quite hard for the first initial layer, but you do want to be quite gentle otherwise with it. Okay, so we've got that. I think I'm just going to dark up these particular sections again, just using the same brush, just to dark up those ones that you can see are a lot darker than the others. Okay, and then I'm going to do this orangey section over here. So again, just looking for the darkest area of this orange, and if you don't feel it's quite dark enough, then you can always just adjust that yourself. So I'm not quite happy with that, so I am just going to adjust that ever so slightly, and then we're just going to fill in this section over here. Just going to make my brush a little bit smaller. Now you'll find in these drawings that there is a lot of ugly stages, and it is one, you know, you hear it all the time with art, just trust the process, but you do have to trust the process, because all of a sudden it will just work. So we've got these layers, obviously everything looks a mess, nothing looks smooth, so we're going to just smudge those layers together just to make a smooth base. So you're going to go to your smudge tool, and right at the bottom we're going to select the More Water smudger, and I'm going to set the size to about 20, and I'm going to set the opacity just below 50%, because otherwise it will smudge it way too much. And we're just going to gently smudge those edges. Again, these are pressure sensitive, so just don't go too rough. Okay, you can go over the whole thing as well, just to make everything look the same, but really focusing on those edges. Okay, so that's your first base coat done, and now we're going to switch over to the dark layer. And then now I use, really for all of these layers, the detail line brush and again the same smudge tool that we've just used. So I'm going to go in with our detail liner. Again, just check the sizes of the brush, so that could definitely afford to be a little bit bigger. That's more like it. So we're going to start off with the darks, like I said. So I've selected the dark layer, and we're just going to go in where we can see those dark colours. And again, I've just selected the colour that I want, and you always want to make sure that you go in the direction of the hair that you can see on the screen. It's really important. If you're struggling to see, I'll enlarge that a bit for you there. Hopefully that's a little bit easier. On these extra darks, it can be quite difficult to see where you are putting the hairs. Just do your best, even if you colour in a little bit more, and that's also fine, because these are all going to get drawn all over anyway, but this is just how I like to do it. So I'm just following that hair direction. You do want to put the occasional like slightly opposite direction stroke, so I'll show you here. So rather than just going like this constantly, you know, just go slightly this way, a bit that way, a bit all over the place, because hair is not completely one direction. So that'll just help to give it some depth and a bit more realism as well. So the bits where it does go slightly lighter, I am still going to put a layer of this dark fur in, but I'm not going as close together. It's just to give it a bit more, again, a bit more depth to the fur. But then the bits where it is really dark, we are going to keep those hairs quite tightly packed. I'm going to speed up the video a little bit now, just then you're not sat here watching this. It's like I said, this is a slow process, but if that's the look that you want to create, like what I'm doing, then it is necessary. It's the same way that, you know, when I work on my pastel portraits, they also take the same amount of time. So if that's the look you want, there isn't really a way to rush it. Try not to stay too much in your head about how perfect this is as well. You've got to remember that this is so zoomed in and people are not going to be looking at your work in this way. You know, if you're making prints or something, they are not going to be viewing it this close up. So it doesn't have to be perfect. You can see I'm not, you know, taking too much care on this section. So I'm going to select the next dark area in this orangey section here. I'm just going to fill in these darker areas in exactly the same way as what we've done in this section. Again, just following that hair direction. I'm just going to go back to our first colour. Perfect. If something isn't quite dark enough, again, just change it. Just go up and change it if it's not showing up on the paper. Okay, and again, just moving on to the next section. Okay, so we've got the base layer in, the base of the darks in now. We're going to smudge these together ever so slightly just to soften those hair strokes. So again, we're going to use the more water smudge tool. You don't want the brush too big, so that's a 5% brush size, and the opacity I'm going to take down to about 25%. And again, don't press too hard on this bit, it's just ever so slightly. You're just going to soften these edges, but we still want to see the hair strokes, so, you know, don't be pressing and erasing everything that you've just put in. If there's a bit that, you know, isn't quite softening, then you can press a little bit harder, but just take real care. Try and take your pen off the paper quite frequently on this bit, because At least then you can erase it rather than erasing the whole thing. Okay, so I'm quite happy with that. So now we're going to start on our mid-tone layer. I'm going to just swap to that. And we're going to do exactly the same thing again, nothing different. We're just going to start adding in some highlights now and, you know, a little bit of richness to this coat. So we're going to try, so we've done our dark, so we're looking for, you know, these areas, these mid-tones that you can see here, these sections. So I'm actually going to go a little bit more orangey on this. And a little bit lighter than what it's suggesting. When you're doing your hair strokes as well, just try and imagine the hair length. So obviously this is a Labrador, sort of medium length fur. So you want medium strokes. Okay, so we're going to leave some gaps. We're not completely covering up the layer below that we've just done. You want to still see that, you know, you can see in the picture that layer does still shine through. So you do want that to be replicated in this layer. Just accidentally switched to the eraser tool. And again, just change your colours as you go through the section. You'll also notice that, you know, obviously again, chocolate Labrador fur, we haven't used, I don't think, any brown. A lot of people do make the mistake of going straight to brown, but that can just make the picture look really dull because the Labrador fur, it's pinks, purples, oranges, and that's what's going to help to bring the depth to the portrait. So we're going to do the same again. For our mid-tone layer, we're going to just start blending that together again using the more water smudge tool. But even on this section, you can already see how it's starting to come together and look a lot more realistic. So we've got the more water smudge tool. We're going to keep the opacity the same as what we did earlier. And we're just going to ever so gently just smudge that layer. And like I said, we are getting there, as you can see. It is starting to look a lot more realistic, but the end is where it does finally all come together. When you start putting those highlights in, that's when it does start looking really realistic. Okay, so there you go. It looks a lot better now we've blended it, particularly this section here where we've already added a little bit of highlighting because it's quite a bright section. So we've added that in a bit more with our midtones. And if you zoom out, then it looks even better. So like I said, you know, we're looking at this on a massive screen, but in reality, people are going to be looking at it at a normal viewing distance, and you can just see how good it looks when you look at it just that little bit further away. Okay, so now we're going to move on to the highlights, and exactly the same again. You're going to get sick of me saying this, no different. We're just blocking in the highlighted areas and just dragging, you can see in this section, dragging those highlights into your midtones just to make it look all that bit more realistic. So we're going to select the lightest colour in the layer. Again, there's no brown being used here. So this is a light pinky, dusky pink colour. And we're just going to block in those highlights. So these are going to be even more sparse than your mid-tone layer because we don't want to obscure anything. You know, there will be some areas where, so this section here, the highlight is quite thick. So you can put a few more lines in this section, a few more hair strokes. Always following the hair direction. You can also go back as well. Obviously, the beauty of working in layers like this is if there's an area you think, oh, that's not quite light enough or not quite dark enough, and just go back to the previous layer and just change it, just add a bit more dark, you know, get rid of some, use the eraser. And also if there's a bit where, you know, you've obscured and going back to the previous layer isn't working, just create a new layer on top. And, you know, if you've done an area of highlight like this section and you think, oh, there's actually a few dark hairs on top of that here, just add a new layer, add in those few dark hair strokes. Really doesn't matter, as long as you get the look that you're after. So again, that colour didn't quite show up, so I'm just going to lighten that up ever so slightly. So you can see again here where this highlighted area has been pulled into the dark. So we're just going to replicate that just to give it more depth. Don't ever worry either that a colour is too vibrant, because adding in those ultra vibrant colours, it really just makes a huge difference. It just makes the piece pop. So normally when I pick out my highlights, I do tend to just do it by eye, but I just thought it'd help you how you can use the colour picker tool. But like you can see, it's not perfect. Sometimes they're too light, sometimes they're too dark, and you do have to play around with it. So I think that's why I do tend to just eyeball it. Okay, so I'm pretty happy with that. I'm going to smudge that all out, and then if there's any areas that need highlighting a little bit more, then I can go over those. So using the smudge tool again, same opacity, same brush size, and just give that, you can actually go a little bit harder on this layer, just with it being the highlights. We don't want any obvious, really, you know, white lines. So use a little bit more pressure than what we've used on the previous layers. It doesn't matter if you go over the whole thing, because we're working in layers, you're not going to smudge anything else. So, you know what, I'm pressing harder, but you can still see those hair strokes that we've just put in. Okay. So there's some lighter little flecks just in this section here, which I just want to put in. So I'm just going to turn the opacity down of the detailed liner, and I'm just going to add in just those few little flecks that we can see. And because these are so fine, we don't really need to smudge these out. You know, same for this section here. You know, this area is quite pale in the peach. Just turn my opacity up a little bit for this, because this is a particularly light section. So I've just turned it back up, and then I will smudge this out. Okay, so I'm really happy with this now. The only section that I'm going to make any adjustment to, so you can see this section here, it's just a bit of a solid line compared to what it is here in the picture. So I'm just going to add another layer, and I'm just going to take that darker colour again, and I'm going to turn the opacity down just so I can drag that into our lighter colours a little bit, just to soften that edge. You'll need to play around with the opacity when you do these things, because it can be hard to get it to show. So yeah, we're just working on softening that edge in that section in particular. Okay, so that's it. The first hair tutorial. I hope you found it helpful. We're going to zoom out now to show you, obviously viewing that from a normal distance. You can see it's not identical to the reference picture, but it's still, you know, you've matched the colours really well. You've got your highlights, you can highlight more if you want to, but this was just to kind of give you an overview of how I do fair. I'll also show you the paper texture. So you can see, obviously, the drawing here. If we go ahead and hide that paper texture, then you can see it does make a difference. This one, ever so slight, because the layers are quite thick, but it just enhances your colours, I think. So I definitely recommend getting these paper texture packs. So I hope that was helpful for you. And like I said, if there's any breeds or hair types that you want me to go over, just put a message in the comments and I'll see if that's something I can do.